They blocked my driveway with concrete, cones, and a cheerful little sign that said, "Thank you for your patience." So I flooded their entire neighborhood. That's the short version. The long version starts on a Tuesday afternoon when I came home from a cardiology appointment feeling old, tired, and not in the mood for surprises. My doctor had just told me to keep my stress down, avoid unnecessary conflict, maybe take up fishing. I remember pulling onto my street thinking, yeah, fishing sounds nice. Then I turned the corner into our cul-de-sac and saw a mountain of gravel sitting exactly where my driveway should have been. At first, I honestly thought I had the wrong house. There were orange cones lining the curb, a cement truck idling like it owned the place, and 3 guys in neon vests smoothing out fresh concrete in what looked like a new sidewalk extension. It curved right across the mouth of my driveway like a smile. A smug little smile. My mailbox had a laminated notice taped to it. I stepped out of my truck, already feeling my blood pressure rise, and read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Neighborhood Enhancement Initiative. Phase 2 Sidewalk Expansion. Temporary access adjustments may apply. Estimated completion 2 to 3 weeks. Thank you for your patience. Patience. My driveway was completely sealed off. Not partially blocked. Not inconvenient. Sealed. My garage door sat there useless behind a trench and wet concrete like it had been put in timeout. I walked over to one of the workers, a guy maybe mid-30s with a cigarette tucked behind his ear. He didn't look up. "Hey," I said, trying to keep it level. "That's my driveway you're pouring over." He shrugged without even breaking rhythm. "Talk to the association, man. We just follow the plans." The association. Of course. Now I'd lived in Cedar Ridge Estates for almost 12 years. It was one of those neighborhoods with tidy lawns, matching mailboxes, and an HOA that sent violation letters if your trash can lingered at the curb 10 minutes too long. I'd never been the rebellious type. I kept my grass cut. I painted my shutters the approved shade of colonial blue. I went to the annual barbecue and nodded politely at people I didn't particularly like. But this was different. I called the HOA vice president, a guy named Preston Holloway. Preston was one of those men who wore boat shoes without ever going near water. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a leased German SUV, and treated the HOA board like it was city council. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Preston, it's Mark from Willow Court. Why is there a sidewalk being poured across my driveway?" There was a pause, then a sigh like I was the inconvenience. "Oh, hey, Mark. Yeah, that's part of the pedestrian safety upgrade. We sent a memo." "You sent a memo saying you might restrict access. You didn't say you were blocking private property for weeks." "It's temporary," he said, his tone turning smooth and dismissive. "Park on the street for a bit. It's a small sacrifice for long-term property value." I stared at the wet concrete slowly hardening in front of me. "You can't just cut off access to my garage. That's not a suggestion. That's my property." "Relax," he said, and I could hear the smile through the phone. "We'll have you back to normal before you know it. Besides, this is going to look beautiful. It'll benefit you too." That word relax did something to me. Maybe it was the doctor telling me to lower my stress. Maybe it was the way he said it, like I was a child who didn't understand how neighborhoods worked. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. That evening I parked my truck halfway down the street and walked back toward my house. The crew had left for the day. The fresh concrete glistened under the porch lights, smooth and pristine. It did look nice, I'll give them that. A graceful curve of sidewalk wrapping the inside of the cul-de-sac. And then I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. Right at the lowest point of the street, where rainwater always collected during a storm, there was a storm drain. A big one. It served the entire circle. And the new sidewalk lip they'd poured extended directly over part of that drain's inlet, narrowing it. I crouched down and ran my hand along the edge. Whoever designed this hadn't adjusted for runoff. The opening was smaller now. Not by much, but enough. Now here's the part one don't usually lead with. My dad was a civil engineer. Drainage and municipal planning were his thing. I grew up around blueprints and topo maps the way some kids grow up around baseball cards. When he passed, I inherited a stack of old surveys and easement documents related to this land, back from when the development was first carved out of farmland. That night, I dug them out of a plastic bin in my garage. Sure enough, there it was. A drainage easement running beneath the back third of my property. The culvert under that storm drain fed directly into a reinforced concrete pipe that ran under my backyard before emptying into a retention pond behind the tree line. And the language was clear. Any structural modification within 50 feet of the primary drainage line required written approval and county review. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that clause for a long time. Because here's the thing about HOAs. They thrive on people assuming they're powerless. They bank on the idea that no one wants to make a fuss. And most of the time, they're right. But they hadn't asked. They hadn't reviewed. They hadn't even checked. The next morning, instead of calling Preston back, I called the county engineering department. By noon, an inspector named Carla Ruiz was standing in the middle of our cul-de-sac in a hard hat, flipping through rolled-up plans. She was calm, methodical, and completely unimpressed by the HOA's confidence. Who approved this overlay near the inlet? She asked one of the site supervisors. The supervisor glanced toward Preston's house. Within an hour, a bright orange notice was taped to a cone. Stop work order. I watched from my porch as the crew packed up early, confusion spreading through the neighborhood like gossip. Preston came storming out of his house, tie still on, phone glued to his ear. He saw me watching. I gave him a small wave. And that should have been the end of it. They could have cleared my driveway, revised the plans, maybe even apologized. But instead, Preston marched across the street and said, "This isn't over, Mark." And I believed him. That was the moment it stopped being about concrete. It became about control. Preston stood at the edge of the torn-up concrete, like a general surveying a battlefield he didn't expect to lose. His loafers were dusted with cement powder, his jaw tight, phone still in his hand like it was a weapon that had failed him. "You went to the county?" he said, not even trying to hide the accusation. "I went to the people who actually approved drainage modifications," I said. "You should try it sometime." His eyes narrowed just a fraction. "This project was voted on by the board." "That's great," I said. "The board doesn't outrank gravity." He didn't like that. Over the next 2 days, the cul-de-sac turned into a low simmering pot of neighborhood politics. People walked their dogs slower than usual. Curtains shifted. I got 2 text messages from neighbors asking what was going on, and one from a guy named Eli across the circle who just wrote, "Bold move." Preston and the board sent out another memo. This one had a different tone. "Temporary delay due to unexpected permitting clarification. We appreciate your continued patience." Patience again. Meanwhile, my driveway was still half buried under gravel and broken forms. The crew had stopped work but hadn't cleared access. I called the management company. They said they were waiting for revised drawings. I asked when I'd be able to use my own garage. They said hopefully soon. Hopefully. That word sat with me the way relax had. Here's the thing. I don't like confrontation. I'm not wired for drama. I'm the guy who returns his shopping cart even when it's raining. But I also don't respond well to being dismissed. And what bothered me most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the assumption. The way Preston had laughed when I mentioned private property, like that concept was flexible if you wrapped it in a community improvement label. So I started digging deeper. Carla, the county inspector, was surprisingly open once she realized I wasn't trying to make her life harder. I brought her coffee the second time she came out to review revised plans. We stood near the storm drain while she explained that the HOA had submitted updated drawings to slightly adjust the sidewalk curvature. "They're trying to keep the aesthetic," she said carefully. "Of course they are." I asked her a question that had been sitting in my mind since I found the easement. If someone were to modify the drainage inlet on private property within their easement rights, that's legal, correct? She looked at me for a long moment before answering. If it's within code and properly permitted, yes. Property owners can make improvements on their side of the line. Why? Just curious, I said. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about my dad at the kitchen table when I was a kid, explaining how water always wins. You can redirect it. You can slow it down. But you never ignore it. Because it will find the lowest point, and it will collect there. Cedar Ridge's lowest point was that drain. And that drain fed under my backyard. I pulled the surveys back out and laid them across the dining room table. The culvert entrance was technically on my property line, with an easement granting the neighborhood drainage access. It did not, however, prohibit structural enhancement on my side, as long as flow capacity wasn't permanently reduced below code minimum. That clause mattered. The next morning, I called a contractor I'd used years ago to rebuild my deck, a no-nonsense guy named Ray with hands like cinder blocks and a permanent squint from working outdoors. "Ray," I said, "how fast can you pour a small retaining lip near a drainage inlet?" He laughed. "That depends. You trying to keep water out or in?" I hesitated just long enough for him to hear it. "In," I said. There was silence on the other end. Then, "Well, that's a first." I explained the situation carefully, not as revenge, but as modification. We would construct a removable concrete barrier just inside my property boundary, creating a temporary flow restriction, not eliminating drainage, not violating code, just narrowing the effective intake area from my side. If the HOA wanted to play fast and loose with engineering assumptions, we could play by the book. Ray came by that afternoon with a level, measuring tape, and the kind of grin you only see on men who enjoy a little lawful mischief. "You sure about this?" he asked, looking at the culvert opening at the back edge of my yard. I nodded. "All permitted. Because here's the part people might not understand. I didn't do this in secret. I filed the paperwork. I paid the fee. I submitted a modification plan that described it as a drainage efficiency experiment pending community compliance resolution. That phrasing took me an hour. Carla reviewed it the next morning. She called me personally. "You're threading a needle here, Mark. Am I within code?" "Yes." "Then I'll take my chances." By late afternoon, Ray's crew was mixing concrete in my backyard. The sound of it felt almost cinematic, like the score building before the second act twist. We formed a clean, rectangular barrier just a few inches high, but positioned precisely to alter intake speed during heavy rainfall. It didn't block the pipe entirely. It just made it work harder. Preston must have heard the mixer because he showed up at my fence before the concrete cured. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Improving my property," I said evenly. "You can't interfere with shared drainage." "I'm not. County approved. You can call Carla if you'd like." He looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. "This is retaliatory." "No," I said. "This is responsive." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're going to hurt your own neighbors over a driveway?" "You blocked access to my home for weeks without consent," I replied. "Over aesthetics." That word hung between us. He left without another sentence, but his expression told me he believed I wouldn't go through with it, that this was posturing. And maybe, part of me wondered if he was right. Because once you set something in motion, you can't control how far it rolls. 3 days later, the sky turned the color of old steel. I remember the humidity first. That thick, charged stillness that sits in the air before a real storm. The weather report said heavy rainfall, localized flooding possible. I stood at my kitchen window watching the first drops hit the pavement. There's a strange calm before you test a theory. The rain started steady, then escalated into sheets. Water rushed along the curb line exactly like it always did, funneling toward the drain at the center of the cul-de-sac. Only this time, intake was slower. I could see it from my front porch. The drain was swallowing water, but not fast enough. The narrowed path meant pooling began sooner. Nothing dramatic at first, just a widening mirror across the asphalt. I felt something twist in my chest. Not guilt exactly. More like anticipation mixed with the awareness that I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Within 30 minutes, the water reached the bottom of Preston's driveway. I watched him step outside under an umbrella, glance down the slope, and freeze. The rain kept coming. By the time the water crept over the curb and started licking at the edge of Preston's driveway, the cul-de-sac had gone quiet in that eerie way neighborhoods do when something unusual is happening and everyone's watching from behind glass. The rain wasn't letting up. It wasn't a quick summer shower. It was the kind of steady, unapologetic downpour that soaks through everything and tests every weak point in a system. Water kept funneling down both sides of the circle, converging at the drain like it always had. Only now it hesitated. It swirled. It stacked up. Within the hour, the street looked less like pavement and more like a shallow pond. I stood under my covered porch, coffee in hand, dry as could be, and watched gravity do what gravity does. Across the way, Preston was no longer pretending this was minor. He was in rain boots now, pacing at the edge of the waterline, phone pressed to his ear. His wife was dragging sandbags from their garage. 2 houses down, Eli had rolled up his jeans and was trying to clear debris from the drain with a rake. It wasn't clogged. It was just overwhelmed. And overwhelmed systems don't care about neighborhood newsletters. The water reached the midpoint of Preston's driveway, then slipped past it. I saw him step back as it touched the concrete threshold of his garage. His SUV sat inside, gleaming and useless. That's when he looked up at my house. Not casually, not accidentally, directly. Even from across the widening sheet of rainwater, I could see the realization settling in. The memory of our conversation at my fence. The permit. The calm way I'd said responsive. He started across the street without the umbrella. By the time he reached my front steps, his boots were sending up little waves. Water sloshed around his ankles. His hair was plastered to his forehead, expensive jacket soaked dark. "You need to remove that barrier," he said, not even greeting me. His voice was tight, strained in a way I hadn't heard before. "The whole circle is flooding." I took a slow sip of coffee. "My driveway is still blocked. We're working on revised plans." "It's been over a week," I said. "My garage is unusable." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "This isn't the time for leverage games." "Leverage games?" I tilted my head. "You mean like blocking someone's property and telling them to relax?" He exhaled sharply. "This affects everyone." "So did your decision," I said quietly. "You just assumed I'd absorb it." Lightning cracked somewhere behind the tree line. The rain intensified, if that was even possible. From the corner of my eye, I could see water beginning to creep into the lower edge of the Hendersons' driveway. Their finished basement sat just below grade. I knew that because they'd shown me photos once at a barbecue. Preston followed my glance. "If that basement floods," he said, "that's on you." "No," I replied evenly. "It's on a design that didn't respect existing infrastructure. I modified my property legally. The county signed off." He stepped closer, lowering his voice again. "Remove it. We'll clear your driveway tonight." "Tonight?" "Yes." I considered him for a long moment. "You had that option before the rain," I said. "You chose not to use it." His jaw clenched. He was used to negotiating from a position of advantage, used to people folding under pressure. But water doesn't negotiate, and neither do consequences once they start unfolding. Behind him, a garage door across the circle began to open. Water spilled inside like it had been waiting for permission. Preston turned at the sound, then back to me. "What do you want?" There it was. Not outrage. Not authority. A question. I set my coffee down on the porch railing. Full driveway access restored immediately. Not patched. Not temporary. And $15,000 in restitution for property disruption, loss of use, and the time I've spent correcting your oversight. His eyes widened. "That's absurd." "Is it?" I asked. "How much is a flooded basement going to cost? How much is one insurance deductible multiplied by 10 houses?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because at that moment, Eli's voice carried through the rain. "Preston, it's coming up through the Hendersons' yard." Preston looked back once more at the rising water, then at me. The calculation was visible. Pride versus math. "You're enjoying this," he said. "No," I replied honestly. "I'm learning from it." He left without another word. The emergency HOA meeting was called that same night, relocated to the public library because the clubhouse parking lot was under 6 inches of water. I didn't go immediately. I waited for a knock. It came around 9. This time it wasn't just Preston. It was the entire board. 3 men, 2 women, all damp, all exhausted, all suddenly aware that authority feels different when you're standing in soggy shoes. "We've agreed to your terms," Preston said, voice tight but controlled. "Driveway cleared first thing in the morning. Payment upon completion." "Certified check," I said. He nodded once. No one apologized. But they didn't argue either. By noon the next day, heavy equipment was back on my curb, not pouring concrete, but tearing it up. Gravel was hauled away. Forms were removed. My driveway reopened like it had never been touched. I watched from the garage as the last obstruction disappeared. An hour later, Preston walked over with an envelope. He didn't meet my eyes when he handed it to me. $15,000. I waited until the check cleared before calling Ray. We removed the barrier that afternoon. It took less than 2 hours to chip away what had caused so much panic. That night, the sky cleared. The street dried slowly over the next day, leaving behind a faint tide mark along the curb like a reminder etched in silt. Conversations in the cul-de-sac shifted. People waved at me differently. Some with appreciation, some with caution. Preston stopped making eye contact entirely. And here's the part I've thought about the most since then. Was I right? Legally, yes. Every step was permitted. Documented. Approved. Morally? That depends on who you ask. I didn't create the storm. I didn't design the flawed sidewalk. I didn't ignore the easement. But I did see the weakness in the system, and instead of quietly fixing it for everyone, I used it to force accountability. Would they have listened otherwise? I don't think so. My driveway has remained clear ever since. No more enhancement initiatives without consultation. No more cheerful memos about patience. When it rains now, I sometimes step out onto the porch and watch the water rush toward that drain. It swallows it efficiently, unobstructed, exactly the way it was originally designed to. And I think about something my dad used to say. You can fight a person, you can fight a board, but you never fight the flow. You either respect it or you pay for it. So I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far? Was it justice or just revenge dressed up in permits and paperwork? If you were in my place, driveway blocked, concerns dismissed, would you have done the same, or would you have let it go for the sake of the neighborhood? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read all of them. And if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA, or watched power get a little too comfortable, hit subscribe. There's something about ordinary people pushing back that never gets old. Because sometimes the lesson isn't about flooding a street. It's about reminding people that control is an illusion, especially when water's involved.